Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited that you are choosing to take some time, some valuable time out of your busy schedules today to join us for this opportunity to engage in a much needed conversation around suicide prevention for youth from communities of color. We know that we are going through a challenging moment in our global and in our nation's history with a pandemic, with a modern civil rights movement happening, a reckoning with racial injustice in our country. And we at Source of Strength want to do all that we can do to empower ourselves and our schools and our communities to do good work that will continue to reduce risk around suicidality and other issues, dating violence, bullying and harassment, substance use, misuse, but also to boost protective factors, right? To increase life and well-being throughout our schools and communities and for everyone. And we know that there's some real barriers and roadblocks that need to be dismantled. And the change needs to be brought not only to individuals, but to our schools and to our communities to change the systems that prevent thriving and well-being, but to increase the things that lead to the leading causes of life. And so I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker for today for this first kind of series of national webinars that we want to empower adult advisors and trainers and our staff and everyone who lives in the ecosystem of Source of Strength to empower us to do this work better. And so I want to introduce my friend, Dr. Sherry Davis Moloch, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Moloch graduated with honors from Dartmouth College in 1979, earned a master's degree in 1981 and a doctoral degree in clinical community psychology in 1985 from the University of Maryland, College Park. In May 2000, if that wasn't enough, she graduated with honors with a Master's of Divinity degree from Howard University, and along with her partner as a founding pastor of the Beloved Community in Maryland, where they focus on family healing and designed to bring spiritual and physical and emotional healing to their community and to congregants and participants of life together. So, Dr. Sherry Moloch, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you. Let me just say, for format-wise, before I do, for those of you who are new to Zoom webinars, you can chat with everyone in the bottom. You can share your questions in the Q&A section and vote them up, and we'll get to those at the end. Dr. Moloch is going to present for about a half an hour, and then we'll engage in a lively conversation for about a half an hour, and then we'll take questions and responses from the audience the last 15 minutes. So sorry to interrupt you. Welcome, Dr. Moloch.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for having me. Hello, everyone. Hopefully in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, we call it DMV, we're having pretty good weather. And the day before, we're supposed to have horrific weather. So I hope that everybody there is safe and sound. I want to thank Dan again for inviting me to do this. And also shout out to Cody, who's doing all the tech stuff. And also, I love the music you guys had. I was actually dancing to it before we started. So good music. I'm going to be sharing some slides with you, and we're going to, as Dan said, we're going to talk for about, I'll present for about 30 minutes roughly, and then we'll have some discussion, lively dialogue between Dan and myself, and then we will have some discussion and Q&A from the audience. Okay, so again, I'm going to be talking about suicide prevention from youth from communities of color. I'm going to be focusing mostly on African American youth because that's the area that's the community that I normally work in. And so we can go and get started. Whenever I do a presentation, whether it's in a scientific conference, whether it's in a talk like this, where I'm talking to stakeholders, whether I'm in a faith community, I always do this slide. And this is my slide that I love to do, in part because I love to show off my family. That's probably the main reason. But I also want to bring to your attention that we all have multiple contexts. And I'm sure some of you heard the concept intersectionality. That's important to me because we bring our context with us, our multiple contexts, and those contexts shape the kinds of communities that we're interested in working in, the kinds of research questions that we ask, and then the research questions themselves will shape what kinds of answers we come up with. And so that's really important. So I want to share with you all of the context that I bring to the work that I do, whether it's in educating doctoral students and undergraduate students, whether it's in talking with communities, whether it's in operating in a faith-based community, as Dan said, my husband and I co-pastor a church together, whether it's data collection and developing a grant proposal. We bring all of this context with us. So on the upper left-hand, my left-hand corner, that's my dad. And I showed that picture because he has got good genes. This is him when he's about 90 years old. He's 94 now. He's in really great health, sound mind, still active. He walks about 2 to 3 miles a day. My brother and I are jealous of him because he weighs the same thing he weighed when he married my mom over 60 years ago. And he's in great health. This is a picture of myself and my husband at our church. We've been married for 34 years, been in love for 35 years. It's one of those love at first sight kinds of stories, which is interesting because before him, I didn't believe in love at first sight. But we've been happily married for 34 years. This is a picture of me preaching in my church. We have a small United Church of Christ congregation in the suburb of Maryland, and we have about 60 to 70 members. And right now, because of the COVID pandemic, 19 pandemic, we are meeting virtually. This is my oldest daughter who's almost 30. This is her ex-boo. They're no longer together, but we still like him, so we still claim him. This is my husband, my youngest daughter who's 26, my son who is 28. I'm really happy camper right now because all of my kids are home, and I'm one of those rare parents that likes it when all their kids are home because I know they're safe, particularly in the context of the pandemic. This is my oldest granddaughter, Michaela, who also lives with us and has lived with us her entire life. Her mom is my oldest daughter. This is Aaliyah, who's almost 3, and she's Jelani's daughter. They live in California. Beloved is one of my favorite books of all time, and my favorite author is Toni Morrison. So I'm an avid reader. And one of the things I really encourage graduate students, everybody I talk to, you got to play every day. No matter how busy you are, you need to play every day. And so what I do, one of the things I do to play is I read books. I'm an avid dog lover. I've always had dogs. This is our oldest dog, Callie, who's a 10-year-old golden retriever mix. And this is Flirt, who's a 4-year-old German Pinscher mix. So we always get rescue dogs. Hopefully you're not going to hear them today because I have bribed them into going into the basement where my husband's working. So hopefully they'll stay down there. This reflects my research. I do suicide prevention and HIV prevention, primarily for African-American adolescents and young adults. And some of that work is in faith communities and some of it is not. This is me in my role as a clinical psychologist. I am a licensed therapist. I have been my whole career. I have never done clinical work full time, but I do still do a little bit of it even now. And we certainly supervise our graduate students and we have an in-house training center, mental health center in our department. This is The Wire because it's my favorite show of all time. And I'm also from Baltimore, which is where the show takes place. This is another thing I do for fun. I needlepoint. My youngest daughter is very interested in East Asian communities. And so she spent 2 years in China and 2 years in Korea after graduating from college. She just got back from Korea right at the beginning of the pandemic. And that's an example of a Korean drama that we watch, which was called Itaewon Class. So we're binging on Korean dramas on Netflix. I love all kinds of cuisine, but probably my favorite is Thai. And I don't know why, I just like it a lot. And I miss it a lot. I put on the COVID-19, I'm trying to take 15. I'm taking some of that off. So I'm leaving Thai food alone right now. I like to stay physically fit. And so this is just one example of what I do. I do Zumba 3 days a week. In fact, I'll be doing it tonight. And then last but not least, this is my favorite tea. For those of us who have sinus problems, this is citron tea. Really, really clears up your sinuses. So this is in a nutshell who I am. And I bring all of these aspects of myself to the work that I do. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem for suicide in communities of color with youth. We're going to talk about risk and protective factors. Spend a little bit of time talking about the impact of COVID-19 and the current highlighting of racial injustice in our country. I don't like to say is just racial injustice. We've always had racial injustice. We're just highlighting it right now. In different historical periods, we have highlighted it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches to interventions and preventions. These are just some general suggestions. Most of my prevention intervention work is done in faith communities and partnering with faith communities, but I'll be talking about other strategies as well. So we want to learn about the scope of the problem of suicide for youth from communities of color. We want to apply that knowledge about suicide preventions in ways that are culturally relevant, and I think that's really important, and understand the importance of using culturally salient approaches in suicide prevention. So I just want to make sure we have the same definition. Suicide ideation involves the thoughts of harming or killing oneself. And when someone is having suicide ideation, we typically do risk assessment, and we're looking at the frequency and the intensity and the duration of the thoughts. Then we have suicide attempts, which is a potentially injurious behavior that has to be directed toward the self. Really key here is the goal of that behavior is to die, and that the likelihood that there's some probability that that would actually happen. But a suicide attempt may or may not result in injury. And unfortunately, there are many people who make suicide attempts who never receive any medical attention. And the suicide is actually a death that's caused by self-directed injurious behavior. Again, the intent has to be to die as a result of that behavior. And we don't typically use the word commit suicide, because suicide up until probably the early 20th century used to be a crime against the state. And to say to commit suicide is like committing a crime. And we don't want to convey in any way that this is criminal behavior. And so I typically say, this is very controversial about what terms that we use, but generally speaking, I say fatality from suicide or a suicide death. And just to let you know that suicide is a serious problem in the United States. It's the 10th leading cause of death when we look across all age groups, gender, sexual orientations, and racial ethnic groups. This is just a picture depicting what I just talked about. You'll see at the bottom that this is looking at people who are 18 years and older. And you'll see that about almost 1.5 million people attempt suicide in the United States. And these are reported suicides. So we know this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably 3 to 4 more people who attempt suicide than actually gets reported. About half of those people receive medical attention. About a little over 2/3 of those people are hospitalized at least overnight or longer for a suicide attempt. And then about 11 or 12% of those people will end up, unfortunately, with a suicide fatality. I'm going to be focusing on looking at the scope of the problem, looking at high school age students or adolescents and young adults. So this is the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's a survey that comes out every 2 years from the CDC, and they do a sample of, it's about 38 or 40 high schools around the country. They are randomly sampled, and this data is weighted to make sure that groups who are underrepresented can be represented in the data set itself. So one of the questions that are asked is, how often have students felt sad or hopeless for most of the time during the last 2 weeks in a row, and ever, for at least 2 weeks in a row, ever during the 12 months before the survey. So you'll see almost 1/3 of students reporting feeling sad or hopeless. Pretty typical that the rates for females are almost twice that of males. You will see that for this data, there's no difference in grade levels. And what you will also see is that for this survey year, Hispanic youth, which is 33.7%, are significantly more likely to report feeling sad and hopeless compared to Black youth and also compared to white youth. This is looking at those who have seriously considered suicide. The total group is 17.2%. Again, females are about twice as likely as males to seriously consider attempting suicide. No differences between grades. And here you'll notice that white students are significantly more likely to report seriously thinking of attempting suicide compared to Black students, and they're at 14.7%. Now this slide, you're going to notice that those who actually attempt, that their racial differences, the pattern changes. So the total number who have attempted suicide is about 7.4%, almost twice as many females again as males. Here there are grade differences, but the people in the younger grades, 9th and 10th grades, are significantly more likely to attempt suicide compared to older adolescents. And some of us believe that this might be due to a couple of things. One of this could be with the onset of puberty. Could also be due to the transition that young people make into high school. And that transition, as we know, can be very challenging for some young people. But notice here that the pattern for attempts compared to thinking about attempting and even reporting sadness and hopelessness is very different. So here, the largest group are Black students, and Black students are significantly more likely than white students and Asian students to actually attempt suicide. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth in general between the ages of 10 and 19. Unfortunately, we know that in the 25-year period between 1991 and 2017, the suicide attempt rates rose 73% for Black adolescents and was even more precipitously increased between Black adolescent boys, which was 122%. And there was a landmark study that came out about 5 years ago in JAMA that found that the suicide rates for Black children between the ages of 5 and 12 doubled that for white children. That was the first time since they've been recording this data that Black children had higher rates, younger Black children had higher rates of suicide compared to white children. We also unfortunately know that suicide rates, attempt rates, ideation, and deaths are higher amongst LGBTQ or sexual minority youth. Unfortunately, this is a good example of when we don't ask the question, we don't get the answer. So this is not probably a new phenomenon, but it's only been relatively recently that we were asking kids about their gender expression and sexual orientation. And so this is not that it's new phenomena, but it's new to us because we're starting to ask the right questions. So 40% of LGBTQ youth seriously consider attempting suicide. This is using the same CDC data. 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth report being physically threatened or harmed in their lifetime because of their identity. About 29% have experienced homelessness. We know that many youth, unfortunately, when they decide to disclose their sexual identity or gender expression, are sometimes kicked out of their homes. And that's one of the things we're actually worried about with the COVID-19 pandemic. For college students who are now home again, for some of them, they're able to live more openly and live into their authentic selves in college, and they're not able to do that at home. And then we know that 86% of the same youth have reported that the recent political climate has negatively impacted their well-being. So here we're looking at, this is the same CDC data. So the sad or hopeless in the last 2 weeks, this number is the same, 31.5%. But look at the rates compared to heterosexual youth compared to lesbian, gay, or bisexual youth. And so it's 2.5 times that rate. And this same data is similar, is looking at people who have sexual or contacts with the same sex or both sexes or opposite sex. And when young people have same sex or opposite sex combined, that they have the highest rates of being sad or hopeless in the last 2 weeks. The same phenomenon unfortunately occurs when those who are seriously attempting suicide, where you see that lesbian, gay, or bisexual youth are almost 3 times as likely to seriously consider suicide compared to their heterosexual counterparts. And even those who are questioning their sexual identity also have elevated rates. And then this is looking at the actual attempts. So heterosexual youth, 5.4%, 4 times for lesbian and gay youth, and for questioning youth, almost 3 times as much as heterosexual youth. So this tells us that sexual minority youth do not live in communities or homes where they feel that they can be authentically who they are, because their rates for mental health challenges are way above what other youths are. And so this is something that for me is very disturbing, because it's something that's preventable. So risk factors, we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about protective factors. Risk factors are characteristics that increase the likelihood that a person will develop problem behavior. It's important to notice that risk factors are not static, they change over time. Risk factors for suicide can include a family history of suicide. Some of that is because some of the mental disorders that are associated with suicide have what we call hereditability factors. And so there are genetic issues or reasons why, if you have a parent or a first-degree relative who has a disorder like major depression or particularly bipolar disorder, that the likelihood that that will then be passed on to their children is relatively higher. But it's not genes alone, because the majority of people, for example, the hereditability quotient for major depression is about 40%. So that means 60% of people who have a parent with major depression do not go on to develop a depressive disorder. So it's probably a combination of genetic predisposition, but also having high-risk environments. History of depression or other mental health problems. Incarceration is a really important thing to consider, particularly if those of you who are educators in the audience today. So we know that youth from communities of color, particularly males, are significantly more likely to receive a disciplinary action in school. Those disciplinary actions are a direct pipeline to prison, because kids who get disciplinary actions are more likely to be referred to juvenile justice system, and they in turn are more likely to be referred to prisons. Also, we know from research that kids, particularly Black males, who engage in the same level of aggressive behavior as white males, white females, and Black females are significantly more likely to be referred to juvenile justice system than the other groups combined. We also know that having easy access to lethal means, particularly firearms, can be problematic. ETOH is alcohol and drug use. We know that particularly if a young person is intoxicated while they are making an attempt, their judgment is more impaired. They're also more likely to be impulsive. And so about 50% of youth who make a suicide attempt are intoxicated on some substance at the time of the attempt. We also know, particularly amongst young people, that there's a concern about modeling behavior or copycat behavior. So when suicides are reported in social media or more traditional media, and particularly if it is glamorized or romanticized, that we're more likely to get copycat suicides. Residential mobility. So when I do this talk, I always say, if we put a clinic in every school, or if we put a clinic on every corner in a community, and we did not make sure that young people have stable housing, that they have food security, and by food security, I don't just mean that they have access to food, but they have access to nutritious food, and that they're living in families where people have job security, then it won't matter. Because the stresses that are associated with residential immobility and insecurity way outweighs other things that are going on in their lives. So that's really important. There's some basic things that people should have: food, clothing, and shelter. We all know this, that young people need to have security around before they can start thinking about things around their mental health challenges. We've already talked about being a sexual minority as a risk factor. Stigma, not just around mental health challenges, but also help seeking. So one of the things that I love about Sources of Strength is that they try to change peer norms about help seeking to reduce stigma. And that's a really important component, I think, of any prevention effort that you might think of engaging in. Recent losses, it could be relational, doesn't have to necessarily be a romantic partner, it could also be with peers, social situations. Clearly, we're going to see this now with COVID-19, with people losing work, being unemployed, and having financial challenges. And then we know for youth from communities of color that exposure to racial discrimination and racial trauma is a huge risk factor. We also know that these are risk factors that are typically common, many of the ones I talked about for most youth, but we also know there are some that are somewhat specific for certain communities. So we know that loss of faith can lead to suicidal thoughts in Asian communities. A cultural distress is a risk factor for Latinx. These are young people who may be second or third generation who are trying to navigate between their culture of origin and their parental values around that, versus trying to be more acculturated or assimilated into mainstream white culture, and there's some tension there. And so kids who have to try to navigate both worlds have additional stressors. And then last but not least, again, we've talked about experiencing racial discrimination places African-American youth at risk. Okay, let's talk about protective factors. So protective factors are characteristics that help people adapt in the context of hardship. And it's important to understand that when we talk about protective factors, at least from a research perspective, the assumption is that some adverse situation or context is occurring, and there's something else that helps buffer against that adverse risk. Generally, you can group protective factors into 5 categories. When people have strong family relationships and family support, this is really important. When we have religious and spiritual engagement, which is a lot of what my research focuses on. And when we say religious and spiritual engagement, it doesn't have to be going to a formal institution or faith community. People who engage in spiritual practice in private also is really helpful, And this could be things like engaging in prayer, meditation, listening to religious or music, engaging in reading sacred text. All of those things are also helpful. I teach a stress management class for members of my church on Tuesday evenings. And so we open with a meditation, we have prayer, we talk amongst ourselves, we talk a lot about stressors and how we can try to minimize those. And then we end in another meditation. And so it's a combination of all of those things. That's a good example of where that would be more private. Community support. And community support, we're talking about schools. Do kids feel welcomed at school? Is the school a place that's safe for them? Is it a place where they experience risk factors like bullying, not feeling accepted by teachers or principals and policies? I did a study with using Healthy Minds data, which is out of the University of Michigan. And we were looking at what are the kinds of things that students are worried about during COVID-19, but also what are the things that are helpful. And a lot of those, particularly students from communities of color, said knowing that administrators and faculty were supportive of them and behind them and flexible, particularly during COVID-19, that those things really helped to stave off feeling overwhelmed. We know that personal factors are important, positive self-esteem, emotional well-being, persistence in academic performance, and as I'm going to say ad nauseum, stable family housing, stable income, stable employment, and I don't have it here, but food security. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about dandelions versus lilies because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. So sometimes we know that young people are in really, really stressful environments, and it could be for a myriad of reasons. It could be because they're in an impoverished community. It could be because they're exposed to a lot of community violence. It could be because they're in unstable family situations. It could be because they're in a school system where there's a lot of violence exposure in school as well. It could also be in a situation where kids don't feel that much is expected of them academically. And so in that context, we always know a couple of kids who thrive anyway. And sometimes people refer to those kids as dandelions because as you can see in this picture, they can break through concrete. And we say that with pride, right? We say these kids can survive anything. But my question is, why should they have to? Why should you have to be so strong that you can bust through concrete? And so when we use this metaphor as a source of pride, it really isn't, because it's saying something about the environment and the systems that our children work in and navigate through where they have to be that strong. And I don't think that's fair. And it's not fair to expect kids and also to promote that kind of thinking, because I think the other metaphor is that sometimes are these children lilies or orchids? And we know lilies are actually fairly resilient too, but orchids are not. They're very delicate flowers. They have to be refrigerated, et cetera. And so I don't think it's true that we should necessarily be promoting that kids should be dandelions. So it's also, this leads into the whole John Henry is a myth. And John Henry was a person, he was an African-American who was, it's a fable, and he was really strong, and no matter what people threw at him, he was able to work really hard and overcome a lot of adversity. Well, Gene Brody and his colleagues in Georgia did a study of African-American youth who were from high-risk, low SES backgrounds. And these were kids who were really competent academically and socially. They were nominated by their teachers in terms of their social skills. These are kids who many of us would say are dandelions. And they found that while these kids did really well in school and they were really doing well in social activities, they also had what's called high allostatic load, which means that they tested high on biological indicators of physiological stress, which was placing them at risk for developing chronic medical problems like hypertension as adults. So even when we have kids who are looking like dandelions to us, we're setting these kids up to have chronic medical problems later on in life. Say a little bit more about protective factors. I like to kind of think about two things in particular that are important, and they're important because you can help facilitate them in almost any setting. And one of the things that's very protective is when people feel socially connected. And you can feel socially connected at an individual level with your circle of friends and your family members and acquaintances. When I do therapy with people, particularly young people, and sometimes young people get caught up in being popular, you don't need to be popular. You just need to have a couple of really good friends that you can count on who are consistent and reliable. And when we're assessing young people, we ask about that. But also, pardon me, at the community level, do I feel like I'm important in my community? When I was growing up in Baltimore, I lived about 4 blocks, a 4-block radius of almost my entire extended family. And then we also had neighbors. And there was this one lady named Miss Beulah who used to either sit on her porch or hang outside her second floor window. Rain, snow, sleet, or hail. Miss Beulah watched every child in our block come home from school until we all got in. And if we were late, she would call our parents and tell them. So that's an example of a socially cohesive community. In my family, my mom was one of 14, I'm one of 32 cousins. We all babysat. When you turned 12, it was your time to babysit. And so we were very involved in each other's lives because of that. And no one ever paid for babysitter, which used to make me mad, but we knew that we could count on family. So if my parents weren't home and something, happened, I could literally go to Ms. Beulah. I had aunts a few blocks away. I had 2 aunts and 2 families, aunts and uncles in the block that I lived in. So that's an example of a socially cohesive community. So the other factor that I think is really important as a protective factor is not just being in a socially cohesive community, but thinking that you matter. This concept of mattering is really important. It's not just being tolerated or accepted, but I call celebrated and embraced. And this is one of the things I love about faith communities, that you can really feel a sense of mattering in a faith community when you don't feel like you matter anywhere else. And so it's people notice when you're there and celebrate your victories. They're sad with you when you have failures or defeats. They notice when you're absent. They rely on you. They depend on you. They care about what you think. They care about what you say. They care about how you feel. Schools also have the potential to really foster mattering. And so I think this is really important to think about this. And the degree to which people feel like they don't matter is the degree to which they feel like they're marginalized. So one of the things to ask yourself in your institutions is, do the students of color feel they matter? Do they feel like family, or do they feel like guests? Are they there for the main course, or do they only get to come for appetizers or dessert? This is something to think about. Okay, so I just wanted to put everything we've said so far in context. A lot of interventions are aimed at the microsystem. And so this is the level at which the individual resides. And so a lot of our interventions, we want to improve self-esteem. We want to decrease depressive symptoms. We want to decrease anxiety, which is important. Okay, but another way to approach interventions is to do it top down. And so the macro system is looking at things in the broader community, like policies and laws. And this may seem to be far-fetched to you or not your purview, but I'm going to challenge you about that. We know that right now we're all voting, and election is next week, and there's early voting right now. My husband and I got 5:30 on Monday, and we went to vote. But this is important because when you vote, you have a voice in the policies that are adopted in your community and the laws that are implemented in your community. You can also target interventions at the what's called the exosystem, which is looking at more neighborhood. And some of my colleagues do neighborhood effects research and talk about, for example, having a socially cohesive neighborhood is a protective mechanism. Then a lot of where sources of strength is aiming their intervention is at the mesosystem. So they're not just looking at the young person in the microsystem, but looking at what goes on in the school. And then also, really importantly, having wraparound services. So that wraparound services means you follow someone through the system from the beginning to the end so that people don't fall through the cracks. You can also have faith communities and partnering with faith communities at this level. And then we talked before about the individual levels of interventions. All right, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the impact of COVID-19. I'm going to tell you now that I could do a whole presentation on this. The other challenge for this is that this data is just coming out right now. One of my graduate students and I, we have just submitted 2 papers about the impact of COVID-19. One is on a small group of predominantly African-American undergraduate students. We just submitted another one that's looking more at young people from different racial ethnic backgrounds. And then we're working literally on a paper right now that's looking at the impact of COVID-19 on students from the LGBTQIA community. So the bad news is we are seeing increases in suicide deaths in communities of color in general. And that's not surprising. I remember when the pandemic first began, my colleagues and I were all going, oh no, because we knew that what was going to typically happen is people from communities of color already have job insecurity. So they would also be probably the people who would be first laid off. If people don't have job security, they probably don't have insurance, or they have inadequate insurance. They have housing insecurity, they have food insecurity. Combined, and what's different about COVID-19 is because we have to socially isolate and are quarantining in place, that also means we have a decrease in social connectedness. So COVID-19, one of my colleagues said it's a syndemic. It is the combination of several storms occurring simultaneously. And that's really can be devastating for a community. So we have an increase in these risk factors, the job insecurity, housing insecurity, a decrease in social connectedness, which is also decreasing protective factors, while risk factors are simultaneously increasing. So that's not good. The good news is that we do know that calls to crisis centers and hotlines have gone up 800%. The bad news is that African Americans don't typically, and people from community of colors, particularly men, don't typically use hotlines. So this is a good example where you have an intervention that might work, but doesn't work for everybody. And you have to think about how can you tailor the intervention or use another intervention that's going to be more culturally salient and relevant for that particular constituency. And then we're not surprised because we know that economic downturns have led to suicide increases in the past. For example, the relatively recent housing economic recession that we saw in 2008. We're also going to talk a little bit about being exposed to racial trauma. So because of social media, and also because we now, all of us have cameras on our phones, young people are being exposed to racially violent situations and police brutality in ways that they were not before. Before, if you were a member of the local community, you were aware of these deaths, but it was not a national phenomenon. And so I want you to imagine being a young person, and every other week you see these images of Black people, particularly Black men, being killed or being arrested or being tased or being beaten by the police. And so repeatedly seeing these images over and over again is really traumatizing. Being in a community where people are heavily policed is traumatizing. My son, who was 28 years old, when he was in high school, he was going to a high school, and it was a pretty culturally or racially mixed school, but it was in a predominantly white community, which was pretty affluent. And unbeknownst to me, he was getting stopped by the police at least once a week. So the dean of students called me to apologize for this, because one of the days that they stopped my son, they didn't believe he went to school there. So they drove him to the school to see if he in fact was a student at the school. And so he was calling to apologize for me. My son didn't even tell us this happened. And so when we asked him about it, his response to us was, what could you do, Mom? Other than take me to school, what could you do? Because my son at 15 was already accepting that part of his lot in life was to be stopped by the police for no reason at all. So imagine that kind of trauma, that becomes traumatizing after a while. In the Latinx community, with our current immigration policies, young people are frightened and scared to death that family members will be deported. And it only takes hearing about on television or hearing about it from the neighborhood that one person has been picked up and deported that makes kids scared. So we know that in the DC DMV area, we're seeing more and more children, younger children, having separation anxiety disorders because they're afraid to leave their homes, because they're afraid that if they come back, they go to school and come back, a parent will not be there. They're also more likely to live in communities that are exposed to violence, and so they're witnessing violent events more than other communities. And then we know that many Native American children are vicariously traumatized by the high rates of societal homicide, suicide, and unintentional injury that are experienced in these communities. So when I say that young people are experiencing racial injustice, I want to stress again that this is not new. It's just that we're highlighting it right now. And it's more pervasive because of social media and because now we can see these events in real time. I want to say just a little bit about treatment engagement, because we know that there are treatments that work well, but the problem is that if you can't get people to engage in treatment or stay in treatment, this is not really going to be helpful. So the rates of engagement in treatment and treatment completion are lower for Black adolescents than white adolescents. And we believe that that's due in part to negative perceptions of systems of services, feeling that providers are not necessarily culturally competent, or what I like to call contextually competent. Also, we know that because of stigma, they'd be maybe more likely to refuse to or to acknowledge symptoms. We know that from research, African American youth are much more likely to deny suicide crisis, even if they're in the emergency room or the emergency department. And we also know that Black youth are less likely to receive care for depressive symptoms and suicide attempts. And community norms in communities of color don't typically support seeking professional mental health treatment. Then, so why do we, I always tell my students, why should we care? This is a public health challenge because particularly in the Black and Latinx communities, suicide rates are highest amongst Latin and Black youth, and these communities are disproportionately young. So we need to think about developing community level interventions at both the individual, family, and community levels. But we also need to develop culturally relevant, sensitive interventions. By culturally relevant, I mean these are going to be interventions and prevention programs that fit the cultural values of the community you're trying to work with, and that makes sense to them in that community. And then also developing programs within, this is really critical, within institutions that can be sustained. So if we put a clinic on every corner, if the people in the community don't have help-seeking norms for mental health professionals, then they're not going to use that facility. So what are other things that we could do in institutions where people feel more comfortable or more accessible, that is more, it increases the likelihood that people will use the services. And one of the things that you have is sources of strength because it's done in the school system. And we know that at least most kids should be in the school system. Another institution might be faith communities, and we'll talk a little bit later on about why that's very helpful. Okay, why don't we know more about suicide in youth of color? So one of the reasons is we assume universality. We assume that everyone has the same symptoms like depression the same way, even though we know that's not true. Sometimes we use between group design. So we use whites as a reference group and we compare students from communities of color to whites. And the danger in that is if the rates for whites is higher, but it's increasing more rapidly in communities of color, you will miss that increase because you keep saying, oh, but it's lower than whites. So people need to study suicidal phenomena within the community itself, because the other issue with that is that there might be different risk and protective factors. So the one size fit all intervention may not be appropriate for all situations. Also, very few psychosocial interventions have shown to be effective for racial youth, mostly because the youth are not included in the samples of the studies. So we don't really know what works for them or what doesn't work for them. Or if they are in the study, they're not in sufficient numbers to analyze treatment outcomes for them separately. And the other thing, and this is my pet peeve, is we tend to do these studies where we have white students and then we clump, because we don't have enough, we clump everybody else into non-white. And so I want you to imagine me defining you by negation. So we don't say things like we have females and non-females to describe males. We say males and females, or we say non-binary. It's the same thing here. So it's important to include enough people in these communities in the study so you can figure out, does it work for them or not? We also don't know a lot because there's a disparity in funding researchers from communities of color. We know that researchers from communities of color are more likely to do this research, particularly around health inequities and structural barriers to equity in health and mental health. We also know that they are less likely to be funded at every level of funding. So from the time they're less likely to apply for grants. If they do apply for a grant, they're less likely to be passed on to an institute. If they are passed on to an institute, they're less likely to be discussed. I'm about to do a grant review now. And if you're not discussed, then not only are you not funded, but you don't have any information to help you improve the study if you want to resubmit it. So what can we do to help children not just survive, but thrive? And what can we do particularly to minimize or eliminate risk factors and also enhance protective factors at the individual, family, community, and I think the broader level of society? That's at the level of changing policy and laws. And so we're going to talk now in the time that we have left about upstream approaches or strategies for suicide prevention. Upstream means that instead of focusing on the individual, we're going to go upstream. We're going to look at what are things we can do at the community level and at the family level so that we can prevent suicide from even occurring. So I'm going to warn you in advance, these are a lot of strategies. You can pick a few. You probably can't do all of them, but they're just things to think about. So once more, I'm going to say, strengthen economic supports. This is one of those things when typically when I'm talking to people will say, this is not in our purview. And I'm like, if you breathe and you live in a community, yes, it is. Because if you vote, then you can change policies around this. You can decide what kind of housing and whether affordable housing is in your community or not. You can do that by your vote. So strengthening household financial security, enacting policies that stabilize housing, job training programs, making sure that people don't put toxic waste incinerators and in that community. Those are things that we can do with our vote and with our voice. Strengthening access and delivery of services. This is also policy, making sure that mental health conditions are covered in health insurance policies. We're supposed to have parity, but we don't always see that and actually live out into fruition when people are engaging in trying to get mental health care. And one of the things about mental health care is most of us, I bet if I ask most of you, did you pick your health plan based on mental health care? You're going to say no. So most of us don't know what our mental health coverage is until we have a crisis in our community or our family, and then it's too late. Reducing provider shortage, particularly in underserved areas. So particularly in rural areas right now, one of the concerns we have about COVID-19 is that what happens in a rural community where there are only a few providers who can provide mental health resources at a time when mental health crises are going way up. Increasing cultural competence amongst providers, and safer suicide care through system change. What I mean by that is, can we train first responders differently to make sure that they are more knowledgeable about suicide risk assessment, for example? And a first responder is not necessarily a law enforcement officer or an EMT professional. This could also be who are kids more likely to come in contact first. So this could be leaders of faith communities. This could be teachers. This could be school administrators. People who kids typically have contact with pretty often. Can we train them to do more of this triaging to make sure that kids are safe? Creating protective environments. So some of that is reducing the lethality or access to lethal means, practicing gun safety. I'm involved in this year-long project called Convergence, where people they take a polarizing topic each year and they have people on both sides of that polarizing topic and they come together to talk. And this year it's on gun safety and suicide. And because of my expertise in suicide, I'm participating. It's fascinating because these are not normally people I would be sitting in a room with. But I think it's important for us to have these kinds of dialogues because we are so polarized and we don't listen to each other. So we have a lot of assumptions about what the other group thinks about this. And I think it's really important because what all of us want is for kids to be safe. So we talk about gun safety. We also talk about removing the method or means from the household and how you do that. Changing organizational culture and policies that present barriers to treatment. So this could be as basic as, what is it like for someone to enter your system of care? Is it a lot of red tape? When someone calls to get to see if they can see a therapist, how many of you all, if you're a practitioner, update your presence on the website so that people don't have to keep calling provider after provider after provider trying to find someone who takes their insurance? Some of the things as basic as making sure you keep your records up to date. If you're not taking new clients, if you could put that out there so that people don't waste time trying to call you and over and over again just to hear 3 days later, oh, you're not taking new people. So things like that to decrease those barriers. And are there community-based policies that reduce excessive alcohol use? Because we know that, as I said earlier, 50% of young people are intoxicated on alcohol or some other substance during a suicide attempt. This is promoting connectedness. So Sources of Strength is a program that does that. It promotes connectedness, also promotes seeking help from professional helpers and who's a trusted adult. Partnering with faith communities, which is something I love, obviously, because that's what I do. Partnering with and encouraging community engagement. So you can develop suicide prevention efforts with partnering with Boys and Girls Clubs, scouting programs, other community organizations, community advocacy programs, grassroots programs. It doesn't have to be something that's necessarily tied to mental health. Teaching coping and problem-solving skills. So this is more looking at the individual level with social emotional learning programs. You can also do parenting and family relational skills building, gatekeeper programs, which is like QPR, which is when you have a trusted adult who's trained to recognize the warning signs for suicide, and then that trusted adult links the young person to services. Crisis interventions, many communities, particularly in urban settings, have a crisis intervention or crisis center. They do more than suicide prevention. They also help people, for example, people who are homeless, who are mentally ill, find shelter. They help families who are in crisis, maybe finding them a provider or providing or a treatment center program or substance abuse treatment program. They're kind of a one-stop shop place where you can get a lot of information about prevention and intervention for mental health challenges, treatment for those who are at risk, and certainly treatment to prevent reattempts. The person who's made an attempt and has been hospitalized is still at risk for making subsequent attempts. So it's really important to have a good follow-up plan and making sure that that person doesn't fall through the cracks. Research indicates that people who die from suicide have seen a practitioner, either a primary care person or a mental health professional, within a year of their death. So there's something that happens in that time period where people fall through the cracks. And oftentimes, because when people are seen in treatment, there's no follow-up to make sure that they follow through on continuing in treatment. So we need interventions that will help with that follow-up. And then unfortunately, if there is a death from suicide, there's postvention work. For those of you who are in schools, you may have a crisis team or a grief counseling team that comes out when there's a death, not just from suicide, but when there are deaths, for example, from accidents. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about, because some of the students at the school will also be at risk for suicide, particularly after hearing of a friend or an acquaintance who's died from suicide. And then self-reporting and messaging about suicide. I've talked about that, about making sure we don't romanticize when we do report about deaths. So that's it for me. And now it's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moloch, for giving us a really large scope and swath of what do we know is happening in terms of suicidality, suicide prevention, particularly amongst youth and from communities of color, but also what's protective and what can we do, a whole host in that socioecological model, from the individual to the community to the policy level. I wanted to maybe engage you in a few questions that arose for me, and we can have some conversation. And then there's definitely some questions that have popped up in the Q&A. So for those of you out there, lovely to see all these sources, folks from all over the country doing this work and resonating with what Dr. Moloch has shared. Please submit any questions that you have as we chat. So one thing that came up for me in thinking about how you were talking about help seeking, particularly amongst Black adolescents, and very often it being common that Black youth seek or prefer informal sources of support rather than formal support, so like mental health providers. And I've read in your research previously that around some of those informal, that maybe more than peers, they seek help from parents or from community members or clergy. So I don't know if you would say a little bit more about what you have found in your research on these informal sources of support or strength, one might say, that go beyond just this traditional mental health provider.
So thank you. That's a great question. So I think the reality is that African Americans in general don't prefer professional mental health resources. And we know, for example, from research that if African Americans families go to a clergy person for help, they're even less likely to go to a mental health professional. So some of that is just cultural norms, that we don't, quote unquote, air our dirty laundry, or what goes on in this house stays in this house. Some of that is because of abuses in the past, so people don't trust the system. Story I like to tell about this, after my mom died unexpectedly of an aneurysm. And I remember my dad was going through, I thought he was having anxiety symptoms. And so this is how I was in training. So I was talking to him about, maybe you should see somebody about this. And he looked at me like I was crazy and said, we don't do that. So I was saying, Daddy, I'm in training, I'm in a PhD program to be a psychologist. And he said to me, that's sweet, but we don't do that. So I was talking to another family member about that. And she told me this story. They grew up in East Baltimore. And when they were little, and people had mental health challenges, people in a white van came to get them, and people went out in a white straitjacket And in those days, they were doing prefrontal lobe lobotomies. And so people came back very differently. Now, even though we don't do that anymore, that's an example of trauma, right? Where my father has it ingrained culturally and from experience that when people get mental health help, it isn't helpful. And people come back really differently. And so people feel like in our community, we have always taken care of our own and we will continue to do so. So I think that has to be your context, that you understand when you're going to do an intervention, not that you're going to necessarily change that dramatically, but how can you work in that? So when we start with the way we do things works better, we see the result of which is people don't use the services, right? So I'm like, whether it's better or not is kind of immaterial because people are not using the services. So what else can you do to help people seek services? One of those things is something like Sources of Strength, where you teach peers who are valued and who are considered to be, I don't want to say normative, but people who are valued in the community can help lead someone to a trusted adult. Some of that is, can we do workshops and talk about what it means to seek a mental health professional so that we can destigmatize it? So that's something I do in my church a lot. So in my church now, this has taken a couple of years. People talk pretty openly about mental health challenges. People talk about taking medication, but we've made this talk normal. So we talk about it all the time. And I don't think obviously it helps that I'm a mental health professional, but it's not just that, because I've done this in other churches. So I think you have to normalize the talk and recognize that, this is their cultural experience, and that cultural experience is valid. So rather than deciding we're changing the norms in that community, let's work with the norms in that community.
Yeah, I know. And when you're talking, it's sparking for me, a lot of what we do with Sources is to say, let's work with the strengths that are already there rather than just mental health providers are the only way that people seek help when experiencing a suicidal crisis or otherwise. But let's tap into the assets and the community.
Better in the community.
Cultural, yeah. And as you were saying and normalizing in one of your articles, that mothers are very often the family member, the parent who is connecting their child to help. So what would it look like if we did more messaging from students out to empower and validate the powerful work that mothers do in health in a community, and give them resources to connect to and tell their story of how they've overcome adversity, but also create spaces for their own children?
You're just like, right, I'm like in heaven now, because so Black people, the Black community is less likely to have a two-parent household. And so most people give that such a negative message. But these moms who are single moms are doing everything they can for their kids. So rather than deciding that that's a negative or that's a liability, that can also be an asset. Also, when you're looking at who goes to PTA, who decides, who channels children's activities, it's moms. Who goes to church? Regardless of what culture you come from, about 70% of church membership is women. So if you're going to do something in the faith communities, for example, I'm not aiming at the mothers, because the mothers determine whether or not kids go get help anyway. Mothers determine if kids get business care, well-being cares for physical stuff. So moms already do all this, and it's something. Guess what? Moms already know how to do. So let's use that asset.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Not to disparage dads, but I'm just saying moms are there.
And dads, do better. Show up and educate yourselves and get involved with tapping your kids into life. And well done for those moms and dads and others who are already doing it, guardians. But you mentioned, and it came up as a question in the chat box, mentioning that very often or commonly students of color feel like they're a guest at their school, that they're not a part of the family. And maybe they get invited to various groups or to initiatives, but when they arrive, while there might be diversity, there isn't a sense that their voice has power and is shaping the initiatives. So I don't know if from your experience or what you've seen in your own community, what are practices that you would recommend that schools could engage in to increase a sense of belonging, of connection, but also give voice and power to students of color in school? And in terms of that, the Marian Wright Edelman quote of "children cannot be what they cannot see,"
Yes.
kind of plays into it, it seems, in terms of representation in our schools. Can we have a more diverse staff population that also give opportunities for trusted adult ties, for connection and belonging for students of color? I don't know if you have anything you would say.
I think you've said it well, though. I think part of it is having diverse staff. So I think a lot of young people, particularly in schools, public schools, don't see people that look like them. And this is not just for students from communities of color. This is also students from the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have myths about people who from that community are going to be quote unquote pedophiles, or they don't make good role models for kids. But kids need to see other people who look like them and value what they value. So one of the things that we're dealing with right now in our training center is what's happening with the young people from the LGBT community who not only are at home when maybe at homes that are rejecting of them, but they don't have, I call it your tribe. They don't have a visible representation of their tribe anymore because they're closeted at home. At least when they're on campus, there are pride programs. If they're in an urban setting, they may be involved in pride activities. When there's pride, we have a youth pride month in the DC area. So all of that support is gone, and it's also not visible. It's like, where's my tribe? So young people in high schools need to figure out where their tribe is. That's also an important developmental task that they have. But also we have to provide visible representation of their tribe in the school. And also when we invite young people to do this, their voice needs to be acknowledged and heard and affirmed immediately. Because oftentimes what people do is develop a program and say, see what we made for you. And then we get mad because they're not appreciative. But they're like, that's not for me. That's what you think I need. It has anything to do with me. That's what you're thinking I'm about when you don't really know me.
Mm. Yeah. And part of what we love about Source of Strength so much and the Wheel of Strength is to really, that it's just a vehicle to say, tell us your story.
Right.
And use your story to impact your peers and your community, your culture, your voice, to just use sources as a model to highlight all the good stuff that we have in our lives, young and old. But as you were talking about representation, we may also need, we're starting to encourage our teams, if their staff doesn't look and sound like their school or their community, that they need to be creatively partnering with entities and stakeholders outside of the school, across the community.
Right.
You have, very often in your research and throughout today mentioned faith communities as a key protective factor for youth and particularly for Black adolescents. I wonder if you would say a little bit more about any partnerships you have seen between faith communities and schools, and then also one of the challenges that arises with that is that if faith communities have exclusive theological beliefs, particularly around LGBTQ plus youth, that while it might be a protective factor to be a part of a faith community for one population, it could also be potentially a risk factor.
Right.
And it's not determinative whether, what community you come from, whether it will definitely be, but it is a possibility. And so in those partnerships, the challenge of working together, that maybe, one entity has conflictory theological beliefs, that could be a challenge. I don't know if you could speak to both of those partnerships you've seen and also definitely overcoming hurdles.
So first one is, I'm going to strongly encourage partnerships. Even if you don't focus on suicide prevention, you can focus on other things. So my church, my husband and I founded this church, is 13 years old. And the first 5 years of that, we partnered with an elementary school. So we did things like we bought school supplies. These are, in the DC area, you have to have school uniform. We helped find used, really pretty good condition uniforms for kids. One of the best things we did was we cleaned up the teacher's lounge, and we brought teachers donuts and coffee twice a month on the first and third Monday or something like that. We did school drives. We bought school supplies for the kids. And we would just ask them, like, what do you need? So it wasn't necessarily school supply. Well, the thing about the school uniforms, that's something would have occurred to us. They were like, some kids don't have uniforms. Could you get like pretty well used, but things that are pretty good shape, and have them dry clean so that kids can have that? We used to go up there twice a month also, to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for kids who forgot their lunch. Some of
Mhm.
this, now that didn't involve any theology at all. We were just the presents. And so when they had like the Halloween dance thing at the school, we would go there and be volunteer chaperones. We also offered tutoring, particularly in math and writing. Once a week, just a couple of members of the church would go after school, and we would be there from 3 to 5 or 3:30 to 4:30 and just do stuff like that. So you can definitely partner. And I want to stress that it doesn't have to be around suicide, because you need to ask the school what they need. We have to also acknowledge that suicide is a relatively rare behavior, and some schools cannot resonate around that because they're thinking that as far as we know, there hasn't been a suicide at the school in 5 years. So that's not what they're worried about. So you're trying to develop, it's connected, right? You're trying to be connected. And so what do you need? Sometimes I do talks about what's an IEP plan? You know, how do you navigate someone trying to put your child in special ed and you don't think they should be in there? You know, how do you do that? So sometimes we just do programs to empower faculty, empower administrators, empower families. The second issue about the theology part is you're not going to change a church's theology. So that's a no-go. But what we can agree on is that we want kids to have good mental well-being, and we want kids to be whole, and we don't want kids to just survive but thrive. So taking that common path, what can we do to work together to make that happen? Good news is that there are more open and affirming churches, which means that's a catchphrase, which means it's a gay affirming church. My church is a gay affirming church. There's a huge range of what that means. In my church, we have rainbow flag. We marry same gender loving couples. We are in every march known to humankind about this issue. We were very vocal in marriage equality, but some churches are not there. And so rather than deciding this church needs to be this way in order for me to work with them, let's figure out the common ground. You'd be surprised that people move and change their theology. And some of that is being exposed to people who are not like them. That's really important. It's really important to have a dialogue and be able to talk. So where can we meet? At my church, we can do HIV testing, but maybe at your church, we can't do that. Maybe we can put up some logos, some magnets in the bathrooms that have sources of strength on them so that kids will know what that is. Maybe we can put some sources of strength brochures on the community table. Maybe someone from Sources of Strength can just come and talk about resources. These resources could be for anybody, not let's just LGBTQ kids. So figuring out where to meet people where they are and not dismissing them because they're not where you think they should be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and finding some common ground. Where can we serve the youth of our community?
One of the things that you and I were talking earlier, the reality is, and this kind of breaks my heart, but it is the reality. There are going to be kids who go to homophobic churches and they're not going to leave. Because when I first started doing this, I would say, I can find you a church, because I can, okay, that will affirm who you are and all of your identities. And these kids will say, I know, but my great-great-great-grandmother was in this church, and my whole family's been in this church. And what I realized is that for some people, that church membership is very central to their identity, and it would result in a tremendous loss for them to leave it. And even though you're thinking, but this is harming you emotionally, in spite of that harm, and they will acknowledge that, but they will also say, but I have to be in this community because
that it's protective in other ways.
Right. Yeah. And so part of helping young people navigate the world is figuring those things out. I think that we sometimes want to shelter, but part of reality is you're going to be in spaces that are both affirming and disaffirming at the same time. It's complex. And how do we help you navigate? If you want to stay in that space, how can I help you navigate that space in a way where we can minimize the harm it does to you?
Yeah, I like that, of like taking the prevention science of, we want to minimize harm and ensure safety. Here are some simple practices without necessarily challenging you to change your theology, although we would do that as well. It is to say, let's keep kids safe. And we know that LGBTQ plus youth are at higher risk, not because of who they are, but because of the harassment and oppression that they face.
I have worked with churches to say, can we agree that you won't say these things? Like I will say, can we agree that you will not tell children that they're an abomination? Can we agree on that? You'd be surprised. People will say, okay. And I'll say, because when you do that, because I think part of what churches don't realize is when you say that on that child who was struggling is now thinking that they're not lovable.
Mm.
Is that what you meant to say? And they're like,
Not
no,
what you meant to
no. And I'm like, okay, well, if that's not what you meant to say, that's how that's heard. So is there something else you could say instead? Or in my preference, don't say anything at all. But if you can't do that, could we think of another way to say that? Because is that what, because I think a lot of times in church, ministers say things almost like cliches that they're not thinking through carefully the implications of what they're saying.
Mm. Yeah. We can engage in partnerships that help us and others grow, hopefully, and create safer communities. I just want to say to everyone joining, we had a mix up in terms of when we were ending. It was going to be 2:15 Mountain, 4:15 Eastern. I'd say let's go for a few more minutes. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the questions that folks have submitted, if that works for you, Sherry.
Sure.
Yeah. So one more question. As you say, it's not that racial injustice has not existed throughout the history of this country, but that we are currently in a moment of reckoning with it, that it's being highlighted, that we're being challenged to do our work as a nation and as communities. I don't know if you have anything that you would say in your imagining of doing suicide prevention better that serve communities of color more fully and provide wellness and thriving for everyone. For you, what does an anti-racist suicide prevention efforts look like? I mean, many of them you have described already, but in your vision of doing suicide prevention that doesn't perpetuate racist systems and structures that benefit a majority, but that are built and designed to serve particularly the most marginalized or minoritized populations that bear the brunt of oppression and white supremacy. How can we do anti-racist suicide prevention together? What would be a part of that vision for you?
So I think that one of the first things is just to acknowledge privilege. I think, and we all have privilege in different ways. I teach a class on multicultural psychology, and we spend about 4 or 5 weeks on this with talk, readings, dialogue, small group work. But part of it is recognizing that we all have intersectional identities and that we all have privilege and marginalization in our lives, and to own it. And not to, it's I always say guilt is not particularly helpful. Guilt is helpful. It's a good emotion if it helps you to change your behavior, and that's what it's for. But if you're going to feel guilty and dwell in that, that's not useful. And typically what happens is then the person in the marginalized community feels they have to take care of you. Like, oh, don't feel bad, Dan. Okay, you're not such a bad person. There's, I don't know if you all watched the show, This Is Us. They did a really good piece on this last night. If you haven't seen it, watch it on DVR or whatever. So I think you have to own it, but then you have to make a commitment to change. And I think sometimes we get so overwhelmed by what would change look like, but there are small things you can do. You can be an ally. You can lift your voice. You can say, when someone's making a racist joke, you can say, I don't really think that's funny. I think that's offensive. We're talking a lot about this because Thanksgiving's coming up and people have to spend time with family, and they're going, uh-oh. And I'm like, but maybe when Pop makes that joke, that N-word joke, you can say, Pop, you know what? I have some Black friends, and if they were here right now, could you tell that joke? If you couldn't, then maybe you shouldn't tell it at all. It requires you to take some risk. Yeah, it does. And also requires you, I think for someone from a community of color, we're kind of tired of just talking and dwelling on the talk. We want you to do something. And so I think, if, for example, in my church, one of the things that we did was we put a rainbow flag outside our church. And we know what happened? We lost half our membership. Take a risk. Because at some point, if you're going to affirm marginalized people, you need to take some risk and realize you might have even some losses with that, but be serious about it. Have these dialogues and communications. What are other things you could do to lend your support? You can vote. I keep saying vote, but you can vote people out of office who aren't affirming people from communities of color. You can talk about, you can boycott companies that don't affirm. I am not a fast food eater, but the one place that I love is Chick-fil-A. I don't buy there anymore. And that's hard for me because I'm like, it's the only one. But I'm like, now my kids laugh. I'm always boycotting somebody, but I'm like, you know what? Not if I say that, I'm no longer willing to go to vacation spots where the LGBTQ members can't go freely and feel safe. So that means no more Jamaica, no more Aruba. But I'm saying seriously, like put your money where your mouth is. Money talks. There was a case, I think it was University of Missouri, a few years back, where the president of this university was making some insensitive remarks about Black students, and they, challenged him on it, and he said he was not going to apologize. And so it was all this talk about this, nothing was happening. The football team said they were not going to play the first game. They said the whole team, Black, white, Latino, Asian, said, we're not going to play the first game, and the coaches backed them up. Guess what happened the next day? The president resigned. Money talks. So that was just them standing up saying, we're not going to do this.
Yeah, and we know that youth movements have been on the forefront of change throughout history, and we expect that there's a lot of young people in schools who are fed up with inaction and believe that there's some powerful alignment, both for racial equity, that's connected to people's well-being and their mental health. And so that initiatives like Sources, there's some good alignment to say Sources teams promoting mental health promotion and suicide prevention can align with efforts to create change around equity and racial justice. Because, as we were talking earlier yesterday, this, privilege and inequality impact white folks too.
Yes. Yes.
And it impacts their mental health and well-being in a negative way. And that we're not squeaky clean just because we're at the top of the privilege pile as a result of it, right? That we suffer from that, from participating in oppression.
Really important point. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a question that was submitted by an anonymous person. When you ask a young person, is school a place you feel safe at? And the answer is no. What concrete actions would you take to help them develop a sense of safety? And or how are the actions different as it relates to race and ethnicity of a student?
So I think, and it's a really good question, but I would also reframe it to say, rather than what do I need to do to make them feel safe, is what do I need to do to make the environment safe? Because it's kind of like we put the onus of change on the young person. And it's kind of that dandelion again. It's like, say, well, let's fortify you so that you can take all the stuff we're going to dish out here, as opposed to, why don't we change the system? I'm going to tell you a quick story. We consult with a very high performing school in the DC area. And so we developed some stress management groups for these young people. And so part of that was me coming to talk to teachers about once a month about just in-service training things. So in working with the kids, I found out that the seniors had a 40-page thesis paper that they were just really completely stressed out about. So I was asking the faculty, why do you have this 40-page paper? And they said, to teach them to write. And I said, okay, a 40-page paper in graduate school is a thesis. Okay, so you can teach someone to write without teaching them to do it in 40 pages. In fact, it's actually easier, it's harder to write a shorter paper. So how about a 5-page paper? And that's an example of where I'm not asking the kids to buck it up, suck it up, and get more resilient so they could do this paper. I'm like, the paper is unnecessary, stressor. Let's change the paper. So they don't do it anymore. So I don't think we always have to ask kids, what can I do to help you be more resilient in this environment, but to look at the environment and say, does this environment have unnecessary stresses in it? And are there things that we need to change in our system that will make this a safer place?
Yeah, I think that's a great point for our Sources teams, in that we are constantly trying to say, what are the strengths that you have in this moment, but that needs to be connected not only in fostering resilience, but with identifying there are systems that need to change, that are constantly forcing young people to be resilient. There needs to be a both and.
Right. And the faculty were shocked. And I said to them, we don't have 40-page papers. And they're like, why not? I said, because we have 100 people in the class. How am I going to read all that? I mean, really? So I'm like, no, I don't have time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. The next question up from Janelle, who's a trainer from our team. She asked, can you say more about your preference for contextually competent over culturally competent in terms of that language use?
Yeah, good question. So I don't like the term culturally competent because I don't know what that means. What culture? And so I always, and also because I just really strongly believe in intersectionality, we have multiple cultural contexts. So to me, contextual competence means I'm looking at all the contexts that you bring with you, and some contexts are more salient than others. And working with, can I develop competence in the contexts that are salient? So the example I would give you is I went to Dartmouth in the late 70s. I was one of the first class of women to graduate from there. I went to high school in an all-girl high school. I had no idea that people had sexism to that degree till I went there because I was in such an affirming space. I didn't know that people thought young women couldn't be involved in STEM careers, none of that. So when I went to Dartmouth, while the racism there was very salient for me, the sexism sometimes was more salient for me. So if you were going to develop an intervention for me and look at my race and not my gender, I would say you'd be missing the boat because I was just as stressed out and just as traumatized by the sexism there as the racism. So that's contextually competent is and also acknowledging your own biases given your own context, right? One of the things I'm very sensitive to is that most of the interventions I talk about work in an urban setting and not a rural setting, because there's some assumptions about resources we make, but those won't work in a rural setting because they don't have the same level of resources for mental health care. So those interventions, some of the ones where we have, teaching coping skills, that's not going to work in a rural community as well. And also, even gun safety, rural communities are more likely to be gun owners. People are more likely to have a hunting culture. So when you talk about gun safety, that's a different group of people, and you have to tweak your intervention to fit that culture.
Thank you. That's a beautiful vision of contextually competent. The next two questions kind of tie together, so I'll ask them simultaneously. One from anonymous submitter and one from Mark Lomery, our founder up in Bismarck, North Dakota. And the one is, what opportunities exist for neighborhoods to reimagine connection in the midst of COVID? What have you learned about cultivating community within your congregation during COVID? Was question one. And then Mark asks, increasing mattering, belonging, connectedness is a big focus of sources. Right. And are you aware of other examples, promising efforts or programs that have impacted an increase in mattering in communities of color across, whole populations, not just individuals? So kind of two questions.
Okay, so I'll do the first one first. So making connectedness and mattering important in COVID-19 is very challenging. I think the good news is that, particularly for young people, they are pretty tech savvy and use media all the time. So that's the good news. So I think trying to figure out ways to connect kids online or through social media is important. We know that kids are already attracted to affinity groups anyway, so figuring that out. I've been talking to people at universities about this. Can we recreate the tribe online, particularly for the LGBTQ students, so that they can still, because I think until we had the COVID-19, I didn't really appreciate the importance of the visibility of it. And I thought, that's true. When you had that and it was visible, you could see it, and we don't have that anymore. That's a challenge. My church, we're actually more connected since COVID-19, but that's been very intentional. So we created more activities. And so we have our worship service. We have Bible study on Thursdays. We created a book club, which has been going fantastic. And we read regular books like murder mysteries, romantic, whatever. We have a stress management group that meets on Tuesday evenings. And then we have now let me say this, my church is really progressive. We have, sip and dip, where we have wine and talk about topics. We've done, I don't know what you call this, but we'll watch a show at the same time and have popcorn. So we're at the movies, but we're like in our homes. We've had Pajama Sunday where people come in their pajamas. I ask people to take pictures every week. And every week I post these pictures. And initially there was resistance, like, well, we've done it. I'm like, I don't care. I want to see you from this week. So now people do different outfits and they send me pictures. and I post these pictures every week. We have done, unfortunately, 5 funerals since the pandemic, and we have done them all. We've done in person small with it Zoomed. We've done the whole thing in Zoom, just different ways. So I guess what I'm saying to you is you got to be really flexible and creative. And I think if you're intentional about, I need to figure out ways to connect young people, or even in your own community, how can we be connected? The one at the movies I thought was silly, but we had the most fun doing that. And so, I thought this wasn't going to work out, but people were in their pajamas and we had the Zoom screen up and we were talking back to the movie and everything. It was a lot of fun. So thinking about ways to do that, do games online. You could do create a family feud. And young people, because they're tech savvy, the older people are like, I don't know how to do that, but they know how to do it. So let them take charge of it. I think there's that. And the other question is about how to foster mattering and social connectedness. And are there other examples? So I love sources of strength. I'm not aware of one for youth, no. But I think that sources of strength is such a different model. It's a community-based model. And it has community, or developing the senses of community as its center core. There is something called communities of care. I think it's out of UCLA, which looks at this at a broader scope. So communities of care does work. It's been done in limited settings because it's vast. I mean, this is where you really get all the different levels of systems involved, from policymakers to lawmakers, to institutions in the community that can impact social justice. So this would be like looking at your school system, looking at I know in the DMV, we have elite public schools that you have to test into. Is that equitable? Are there other criteria besides test scores that you can use to create equitability in terms of educating kids? Can you think about how your healthcare system is set up? This also requires communities to be honest with themselves about one of the best ways that you can oppress people is through housing segregation. So how are your neighborhoods set up? Are you willing? I know a lot of people I don't want affordable housing in my neighborhood because it brings down my tax dollars, but it doesn't have to. That's what values your house is your perception. No, I mean, just be honest. It's what you think of it. If you think, if you decide the dance community, if we look at our little blocks on here, if that community we decide is great because he's a white male and lives in it, then we'll pay more for that house, same house. If you decide my house is not as valuable because there's Black people living in here, we could be in the same house with the same dimensions and he'll pay $100,000 more. So who determines what neighborhoods are valuable are us. And I'm just really serious about that. So I really feel like if you mean it and you really want to be more equity, then yes, we can have affordable housing. In my neighborhood, we do.
And if we value it, we can shift the culture.
Right. No one's house the price didn't go down. Now, was there a lot of fussing about this initially? Yes, there was. But challenge people, say, listen to what you're saying, okay? Because if you feel that you can keep people out for economic reasons, what's the difference between doing that and racial reasons? It's the same thing. You just have classism, that's all.
That's a lovely vision of action we can take in our own communities to shift culture, what we value that leads to health for others. I think let's ask 2 more questions for those who are still with us. Final 2 questions. And one is from Mish Moore, a trainer on our team, who says it's very helpful to hear that traditional therapy may not be one of the best ways to reach out to youth of color who are in crisis. Mish has heard about barbershops being a part of community and being used for normalizing seeking physical health care and screening for health problems. Could you imagine using like a barbershop style method for normalizing therapy and help seeking?
Definitely. I think that's such an important venue because Black men go there all day and it's a trusted community, right? And it's a place where men can have confidential conversations. There's a lot of emotional intimacy at a barbershop and they're respected people. And I think mental health professionals, we sometimes don't live in the real world and we don't realize that when a culture values a particular setting or a group of people, those are the trusted people. And we forget, they don't know us. Who are you? I mean, you might be well-meaning, but they don't. One of the reasons I started doing things in faith communities this is before I became a minister, was because I knew they weren't coming to see me as a mental health professional. That's why I started doing it. I was like, you know what? How can I get people to get help? Well, they're not going to come to my office, so maybe I should go to them. So I started doing workshops and support groups in the church so that I could get people help in a way that they could digest it and that they would be acceptable to them.
Mm. That's lovely. Yeah. So I think I talk about it as like a social infrastructure. We think of the physical infrastructure in our communities, but what is the social infrastructure? The formal and informal places where people meet.
And it's
Gather,
sustainable.
find out.
Even in COVID-19, I've been so struck with it. Even people in my house, they still go to the barbershop. I still get my hair done. And my hairdresser, she's my therapy. That's what I tell her. I've been with her for 12 years and I go faithfully every 3 weeks. And it's time for me to relax. It's so soothing for someone else to wash your hair. I get my hair done. We talk. It's confidential. I can say what I want to say. And then I can go back home and, fight the good fight another time. And so these are institutions that are sustainable. That's the good thing. They're going to be there.
Yeah. Colleen Carpenter out in Indiana posted, check out Lorenzo Lewis. He does mental health, suicide prevention, education, and barbershops. The Confession Project. That's great. All right. Last question I have here. Sorry, we couldn't get to all of them. Is from Kimberly. It says, as a Black mother to her Black son, my best friend believes she must enforce the dandelion ideology due to the culture and environment of our country. That without embedding that strength, then the environment will take advantage or disregard her son. Curious how that feels for you. How do you support resilience and strength and overcoming while not fetishizing that or not also doing something to change the systems that force?
So I don't want to give the impression that I don't think we should promote resilience in our children, but I also think simultaneously with that is we need to change the system. So I think it's not a coincidence that Black men have some of the shortest life expectancies, and because we want people to be so strong in a system that's designed to crush them. And so when we promote that strength crushing through the concrete and don't change the system, these men will still die young. And I think that in order for that to change, we have to change the environment around them. So yes, I need you to be strong. One of the things we told my son, like we never told my son man up, and we never told him don't cry, because when you're crying, when you hurt, you should cry. Now we tease him. Of the three of my children, he's the one who will cry the quickest. But he's not ashamed. He's like, yeah, I'm gonna, when he's upset, he cries. But because so when people have those pent up feelings, what are they supposed to do with that? And I think that's creating toxicity for them. I don't think that's healthy.
Thank you so much for spending the last hour and a half with us. Will you just take us out on what's giving you hope right now in the midst of all this? Where are you seeing this vision you have cast with and for us happening already? What's giving you hope in this moment?
Well, I mean, some of this is based on my faith, right? But I believe it or not, in the goodness of people, even in the midst of evil. I do. I believe that we are better than we think we are. I believe when I see the young people out marching, I could cry. Even in the midst of all the turmoil that we're going through right now, we're all anxious about the election. I'm like, but there are good people, right? They're on this webinar today. And sometimes we can choose to focus only on the negative and not see the whole picture. But that negative part is not the whole picture. It's real, and we need to pay attention to it and combat it. But it's the only part of the story. And look at the whole story. Look at the young people out marching. Look at them doing it peacefully. Look at, I was sharing with you, I've never seen a march go across the whole world like that. I was like, whoa, okay. I'm 63 and I was like, I never thought I would see something like that. I never thought I would see people indicted for a police officer for murdering a young man in a week. I've never seen that. And sometimes to check reality, I ask my 94-year-old dad, I'm like, Daddy, and he'll say, nope, never seen anything like that. I've never seen so many, I'm not exaggerating. I think this is about my 30th webinar. Okay. In my whole career, I've done 30 webinars in 3 months. I've never, ever done that. Never. some of it's because COVID-19 and we're on Zoom, but I mean, really, the hunger for this knowledge and this information, and the fact that I see universities changing mission statements. I see universities changing their names. You know, I'm so happy that believe it or not, as bad as all this is, living in a time where I see people having real dialogue about privilege, like for real. You know, so I want to encourage people that there's a saying in the faith community: don't get weary in well doing. Like, you take a break. You know, on election day, my daughter and I, our family, we are now picking out the shows we're going to watch. We're going to binge on that day. We've already voted, and that's it. We've done what we can do, and we have to have confidence that whatever the outcome is, we've had really challenging times in our history before. We got through it that time. We'll get through it again. It won't be pleasant, but we will get through it because we can, and we are the ones we are waiting for. We really are, and we can make a difference.
Well, on that beautiful moment of hope, thank you so much, Dr. Moloch, for joining us and lending
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone out in the Sources of Strength ecosystem, for joining. We hope it was meaningful, and we hope to continue the conversation as we go forward in spreading hope, help, and strength into communities. And so thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you. Everybody take care and be safe.
Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.